Hey guys, welcome to the walkthrough Lightroom tutorial. As a professional photographer, I've been using Lightroom for almost 15 years to edit my photos. I use the desktop version for all of my professional shoots, and I love that I have the app available to edit all of my phone photos. So today I'm going to walk you guys through all the tools in the app. It's extremely robust, not always user-friendly or self-explanatory, so we're going to actually walk through every tool in the app. Now, if you're using the free version, some of these tools might not be available to you, but I'm still going to touch on them so that you know what they do. The best thing is probably going to be for you to open your Lightroom app, pull up a photo that you want to edit along with me, and follow along as I show you what each of the tools do. Let's get started. If you've never used Lightroom before, the way that you add a photo is to go to your main library, click on the button in the bottom right corner that looks like a little photo with a plus sign over it, and that will allow you to access your camera roll, and you can choose any photos that you want to edit and import those into your Lightroom. Now we're going to be working with the photo that was the cover for this tutorial. It's a very tricky edit because it's backlit, and I'm going to explain all of that to you, but I thought that would be a great place to start. So the first two tools on the bottom toolbar here are masking and healing. We're going to skip over those and come back because those are actually features that are available only in the paid version. So we're going to start where I always start with an edit, which is the light toolbar. When you click on that light toolbar, the first thing you're going to see is the exposure slider. That's where I always start. Almost always when you take a photo with your phone, you're going to find that unless it's being lit from the front by the sun or a light source, it's probably going to be too dark for your liking. Our goal is always to bring our photos back to what our eye saw. So your phone is trying to expose for the brightest part in your photo, which is why typically it shoots too dark. So in this example, the sky is the brightest part of my photo. So my husband and I and all of the trees surrounding us are a little dark. So I always start with the exposure slider. And I'm just going to slide that up until it looks right to me. Now it's okay if it's a little over or a little under because we're going to be playing with all of the other tools. If you want to start over, just double tap on that and you'll see what happens if you were to slide it to the left. See how the sky is getting really beautiful there? We're going to look at how to make the sky look beautiful while still making the subject look how it was lit in real life. So I'm going to slide this slider all the way up until it looks good to me. Then the next tool that you'll see is contrast. So the contrast is like the difference between light and dark. Super high contrast photos tend to look more editorial or like what you see in professional travel photography and things like that. If you drag that contrast slider down, you're going to really start to mute some of those tones and mute the difference between light and dark. So I always just add a tiny bit of contrast and then I can come back and tweak that again later. The next tool is highlights. Now as you can see, when I brought up the exposure in the photo, I blew out a lot of the highlights in this photo, and what that means is that I lost color in the light areas of the photo. So I'm just going to take that highlight slider. I'm going to show you what it does first. If I drag it up, it makes those bright areas super white. If I drag it down, it starts to bring back the color in those areas. So I'm going to drag it all the way down in this photo. Next is shadows. This is a great way to open up the dark parts of the photo that were shot dark to account for the lighter areas in the photo. So I'll show you what happens if you drag it down. It brings those shadows darker. If you drag it up, it lightens up those shadows. So somewhere around the mid mark, around 50 looks pretty good to me. Next is going to be two sliders that affect your dynamic range. Now the dynamic range is that broad spectrum between light and dark in your photo. Pure black is going to have no detail. Pure white is going to have no detail. So pixels that were shot at the far ends of that dynamic range spectrum are going to have no detail, no color. So you'll see that we have white first. If we drag, I'm just going to drag it and show you what it does. As I drag it up, it starts to really blow out the highlights. As I drag it down, it goes into those highlights and starts to bring back the detail in some of the areas that were overexposed. And then the opposite is true with the black. The areas that we lost detail when the phone camera accounted for the bright sky, I can start to bring those back by bringing that slider up. Or if I wanted a really contrasty image, this is another way to add contrast, I could just bring that way down. So I kind of like how it looks with a lot of contrast there, so I'm going to keep it down here somewhere quarter of the way across. Now I'm going to scroll back up to the top and I think I need to brighten this image up a little bit more. I like a really bright image, so I'm going to play around with that exposure a little bit more, and again, I can always come back. One other button you're going to see here at the very top is the curve. Now, most people like a good S-curve, and what this is just the difference between the highlights, midtones, and shadows. I could teach an entire class on this. I'm just going to really quickly show you what happens if you add a curve to this here. So you can just take and drag these sliders, and it really starts to create a contrast in your photo, however you drag it. I would highly encourage that you just play around with this, see what you think, see if you like it. I tend to not use it. It tends to get a little bit unnatural looking for me, and I'm always going for what my eye really saw, so I typically don't play with that. So I'm just going to hit undo and undo my tone curve there and go back to pick up where we were. Now the next tool that I'm always going to use after I play with the light, again, I may come back to the light, but the next tool is always going to be color. So I'm going to click on that color slider, and more than likely your shot was cooler than what your eye saw. So more than likely in real life it was a little warmer and your camera shot cool. Depending on your phone, now if you're using an Android versus an iPhone, it may shoot a little differently, but you can see as I drag this slider to the right, it makes it really, really warm. As I drag it to the left, it cools it down. I'm almost never dragging it to the left. I find that my phone shoots really cool, and typically it does not shoot accurately to what my eye really saw. So I'm going to drag this and warm it up to what I remember this day feeling like, what I remember the sun feeling like. But then you'll see that as I pull this up, it starts to feel a little green. That next tool down is tint, and that adds green or magenta back into your photo. So this is what we call white balance. You're really looking for pure white in an image. Our eyes can do this naturally. They look at a scene and they go, oh, that's white, and then they know what every other color is. Our brains are so smart. In this image, it's a little green to me, so I'm going to start to add some of this magenta back. And you can play around with this. You may like your photos a little more vibrant feeling, a little bit more whimsical, and you might like a little change of color. And I'll show you some more tricks to do that in a little while. But for right now, this feels pretty good to what I feel like my eyes saw, so I'm going to move on. The next slider down is vibrance. Now this is my favorite way to make the colors pop in a photo without making it feel unnatural. I find that that next slider down, saturation, starts to make things feel a little cartoony, so I tend to shy away from using the saturation slider at all. I'm going to show you the difference between those two. So if I were to bring the vibrance down, it starts to mute the colors. If I bring the vibrance up, it just adds a little pop to the colors. It's affecting really the highlight tones in the colors. Now I'm going to reset that and show you what saturation does. Saturation, as you start to pull it up, it's affecting all the tones of the color. It looks pretty cool, but also a little unnatural. If you were to drag that saturation slider all the way down, that's how you get a black and white. So I tend to like to play with the vibrant slider. I'm just going to pull that up a tiny bit. I don't want it to feel unnatural, but I do want it to feel like what I really saw. The other super cool tools along the top, black and white. If you hit that, that's going to just be the fastest way to convert it to black and white. And if you go down there, you see that that affected the saturation. So I'm going to go back. Now we have those slider tools available to us again. I'm going to skip over color grading and I'll come back. First, we're going to open the mixer. That's the one that looks like a little rainbow circle on the top right. Now this opens the panel for every single color in your photo. If you're using the free version, your sliders may look a little different from mine, but what we're really looking at here is the luminance. So all of these you can click on and affect the colors, each color in your photo. So I typically hop over to orange and I play around with that because that helps a lot with skin tones. So you can see if I drag that down, we start to get Oompa Loompa skin. If I drag it up, our skin starts to look glowy and fun. I like to bring it up a tiny bit, but I don't want to do too much because there's orange tones in the sunset and I don't want to lose those. So saturation, just as I explained before, starts to really saturate those colors. I'm not going to play with that. Hue, I'll show you in a minute when we get to the greens. I typically don't touch the red or yellow, but you'll see the same things happening with those. Greens, because I have a lot of green trees in this photo, I am going to play with those colors. Now, since I increased the exposure of this overall image, I really want the trees to still feel green. So I'm actually going to bring the luminance down. Bringing it up would brighten those greens, Bringing it down makes those greens a little more prominent. If you're using the paid version, you can also play around with the hue. So if I wanted those greens to feel a little bit more warm, I could pull the hue down and make them more yellow, or I could really make them look super foresty green by pulling it up. I'm gonna leave it alone there and just pull that luminance down a tiny bit. I don't typically use the cyan slider or either of the purples, but I always use the blue, especially if there's sky in the photo. This is the coolest way to bring back the blue sky if you've had to brighten up your photo. Now again, I'm not playing with the saturation. I'm just gonna grab that luminance slider and start to pull it down until it feels like what I saw with my eye. Now, anytime when you're editing your photo, you can tap the photo and hold, and that will show you the before. So this is a really good gauge for me on where I'm at with the sky and what else I need to do to the sky. So I'm just gonna pull that luminance down a tiny bit more. This would be another place where I could go into this hue slider and make the sky, change the color of the sky. If you ever see people who edit and their skies look super turquoise, that's how they're doing it. I'm just gonna pull that down a tiny bit. Again, we don't want it to start to feel unnatural. I'm actually gonna go back into the oranges here and play around a little bit. I don't want our skin to start to feel unnatural, but as I'm looking at the before and after, I really want the sky to continue to feel like what it looked like when I took this photo. And so much of editing is about feeling, so I'm gonna just play around with that until it feels good to me. It feels like what I remember seeing, and then we're gonna stop there. Now the grading, I never use this tool. The best thing I can tell you to do is just open it up. It's gonna do highlights, shadows, midtones, and I would just highly recommend that you open it up and pull that around. I absolutely never use this, but if you see, if you follow any Instagrammers that it seems that they always have the same tone over their images or things like that, they're probably using color grading. As my goal is always true to life and trying to bring back what I naturally saw just a little better, I never use this tool. Okay, up next is effects. We have multiple sliders here that all affect the contrast of the photo in some way. So texture, clarity, dehazing all affect the texture, or all affect the contrast in some way of the photo. And again, this is a place where I would recommend just playing around with these, because some of them are going to affect the midtones, some of them are going to be more of a combination of contrast and sharpness. So texture is not a tool that I ever really use. It tends to be seeking smoothness while sharpening, which is cool. It looks nice. Let's look at clarity, what clarity does. Clarity is making it sharper while it seemingly bringing in more blacks. Dehaze is going to, again, smooth color. It's bringing a lot of contrast in as I pull this up. So this is where it's also looking to seemingly increasing the saturation. This is where I just highly recommend playing around with these tools. They're all gonna affect the contrast of your photo, but in a different way. So if you're going for a more contrasty photo, I would recommend going into these 3 sliders and playing with them until it feels like what you are looking for, what you wanna see. Outside of just using that traditional contrast slider, which was under the light toolbar. I think we all probably know what vignetting is. You'll see that there's multiple tools here under vignetting that are gray because we don't yet have a vignette. So I can start a vignette that is light, or I can pull down and do a dark vignette. And what that really does is just push focus to the center and the subject of your photo. Now we have access to all of these other tools below that allow us to change the midpoint of that vignette, to really pull it out or really pull it in. We can then make it more round. We can change the shape of that vignette. We can go in and we can feather that out so that it doesn't feel like such a harsh contrasty line. Like here would be an example of it being a super harsh line to very feathered out. I don't typically use a vignette, but if you like that look, I think the dark vignette is a bit more popular for really bringing like focus and contrast to the center of the photo. You can also play around with the highlights, grain. If you like grain in your photos to look more like film, you can add that in. That's a really cool tool there that makes it really look like an older photo or like a film photo. And then you have the option of changing the size of the grain, the roughness of the grain, to really get the look that you're going for. Next is the details toolbar. This is where you're going to find the sharpening tool. I do use this on occasion, especially if I took a screenshot from a video and I really need to sharpen that up. I would be using the sharpening tool, and I would be using those 3 tools that I mentioned: texture, clarity, dehazing, to kind of try to pull in the sharpness and get rid of the pixelation that comes from taking a screenshot in a video. So once we have added some sharpening, then you can see we also have a radius tool for that, how far we want that to go, detail, masking, and all of these tools just change the effect of the sharpness. I'm typically not playing with any of these. I'm just adding some sharpness into my photo and leaving it as is because I want it to feel as natural as possible. Down here you'll see we have noise reduction. So because we came in and we lightened up some areas of the photo, if you zoom way in, you'll see that there is some noise, and we can play around with this noise reduction tool to try and smooth some of that out. What we don't want to do is use too much, because then, as you can see, it really smoothed our skin, and we don't want to start to lose the detail in our skin and the outline of our body. Color noise reduction is going to do the same thing. If you had a super dark image in the black areas, the noise would have some colored pixels, and so this color noise reduction tool would start to reduce and really just desaturate the color of those pixels that are showing up. Now, the optics and geometry tool you probably don't have if you're using the free version. I'm just going to touch on those really quickly. Optics is more useful if you have shot a photo with like a DSLR camera and you're editing that, because it's going to account for the lens that you were using and try to correct the lens distortion, and also correct for chromatic aberration, which is an anomaly that happens that is like a distortion of color when you're shooting something that has high contrast between light and dark. So often you'll see it show up as like a purple line around the outline of a person, or if you're shooting tree branches, you'll see some purple color variation around the outside of those. Geometry, I really don't know why you would use this tool. It's a cool edit. Play around with it, see what it does. You can maybe create a fisheye effect. There's just really nothing in here that I would ever be doing. So I don't use this tool, but it is super cool if you're doing some kind of fun edit, really getting creative with something. Just play around with it, see what all it can offer you. Again, it's not something that I use if I'm doing any kind of creative editing. I'm typically doing that in another program, but that is an option that's there for you. Now let's go back. At any time you can go to versions and see the different versions of what you've been editing. You can also reset your edits. Let's go back here now, all the way back to the beginning. I skipped over crop, which is pretty basic. There are lots of different options in here for you on different sizes to crop your photo to, depending on where you're using it. You can flip, rotate, straighten. If your horizon is a little crooked, you can straighten that horizon. The presets option, if you are here, you've probably used some of my presets, either my Always Summer presets or my Sunkissed and Pure presets. This is where they're stored. If you don't have any presets that you've purchased, there are some that are preloaded into the app here, but you'll just see that using presets is just a quick one-click edit to a photo. This photo is a special edit. I'm actually going to show you the edit that I used for this photo was Sunjoy. You'll see it is very similar to where we're at currently in this photo. All right, let's hop back to the other last 2 tools. So, healing tool. This is a super cool tool, only available in the paid version, but it allows you to remove things from your photo that you don't want to be there. So you can change that brush size and you'll see how it changes. And let's say I didn't want this water to be here. I could just come in, color it, and then it's a smart edit. So it's gonna look at the spots around where that water was and try to do its best job to match what's around it as if that was not there. And then lastly, we have masking. Now there's lots of super cool options available in masking. Again, this is one that's only available if you're a paid Lightroom subscriber. But let me show you what these tools do. If you click that plus button, you can take a tour of all the tools. there are several options of ways to select certain areas in your photo. So you can tell it to select the subject, you can tell it to select the sky. We'll try that one and see how smart it is. Did a pretty good job selecting the sky. You can tell it to select just a color range. You can tell it to select just a luminance range. You can ask it again to select the subject. Let's see if it picks us out. Did pretty good. So let's say we have us selected. Now we have all of these toolbars available to increase the light exposure on just us, or bring it way down. You could really get creative here with some of this stuff. Bring up the shadows, contrast. Now it's just editing my husband and I. So if I click on the color, we could change anything that is selected. So another tool in the masking is going to be a brush. So you can take this brush and you can change it to all different sizes. You can change the intensity of the brush, so really sharp edge, a really feathered edge, and that will allow you to just color an area on your photo and then edit just that area. And then finally, the tool that I probably use most under this menu are the gradients. So a radial gradient would just create a circle in your photo, and it would just be editing what's inside that circle, or you could invert it and it would just be editing what's outside that circle. The one that I use the most is the linear gradient. And so this will allow you to create a gradient in your photo where the intensity of the edit that you apply happens at the far edge and then it feathers onto the photo. So if I were to use this, for example, I could play with just the sky, and you'll see that it just feathers that edit down onto the photo. So we're going to discard those changes. So those are the basic tools that you'll find within Lightroom. Now, in Lightroom, you are editing a copy of your photo, so you have imported your photo to Lightroom. Once your edits are complete, you're going to want to hit the button at the top right corner that looks like a little square with an arrow pointing up, and that will allow you to save that photo back to your camera roll with your edits applied, so you'll still have a copy of the original and your edits. Let's start from the beginning, and I'm going to edit this photo from scratch so you can see how long it takes me. Now, I have honed this process, as I said, over the course of 15 years, so I can do this pretty fast, but this is a bit of a tough edit because it's a backlit photo. So let's reset this, reset all adjustments, and now I'm going to start from scratch and show you how long it takes me to edit this photo and exactly what I would do. So again, I'm always starting with light. I'm going to go in, really brighten this up. I'm not looking for perfection right now because I'm going to be coming back and playing around with it, increasing contrast, taking the highlights all the way down, pulling up the shadows, pulling white down to kind of bring some of that, bring back some of the detail. I am going to be pulling the black down for a little more contrast, color going in, really warming it up. As I remember, it was a really super sunny day, very warm. That looks a little green, so I'm pulling in a little magenta. Gonna go into my color mixer, pull the luminance down in the blues, pull the luminance down in the oranges. Not quite that much. I don't want our skin to look unnatural. I'm gonna actually go in the yellows and see if I can pull a tiny bit down of that without messing with our skin. Green, I'm gonna pull the luminance down a little bit there. I'm actually gonna change the hue a tiny bit in that. All right, I like that. Going into vibrance, pulling that up a tiny bit. That looks pretty good. Not super happy with the orange. I'm gonna go back. That looks just, our skin looks a little fake, so I'm gonna go there. Going back into light, pull that down a tiny bit. Pull the whites down a tiny bit more. Going to sharpen this up a tiny bit. And I am pretty happy with that edit. Now, the other option is I can just use my presets, reset that photo, go into my presets, and the one that I use for created based on this photo exactly was my Sunjoy preset. That's a one-click edit, super easy. You can find that preset inside my Always Summer collection. That was less than a minute to edit that photo, but if you have a ton of photos from an event or a trip or things like that, you're not going to want to spend 1 minute, even if you are editing that fast, on every photo. So presets just really make it super quick and easy. So let's go and let's edit another photo. I want to edit a photo that's already pretty well lit and show you just exactly how I would edit that. So again, starting with light, just going to pull it up a tiny bit, pulling the highlights down a tiny bit, just so that they're not overexposed. A little bit of contrast, a little bit of shadows. The color looks pretty good. Gonna warm it up a tiny bit. Bring in the vibrance. Gonna sharpen it up a tiny bit. And that is it for that photo. Just a little glow up. That's just enough for me. Let's edit another. Let's edit this photo that has some pretty dark shadows. So again, starting with light, gonna bring the light up to what the light felt like to me on that day. Pulling the highlights down, I don't want to blow out the whites. A little more contrast. I like a little bit of the contrast of the shadow, so I'm actually going to pull that down a tiny bit more. I'm going to pop over here into, I don't feel like I need to touch the whites or the blacks in this photo, and that's just a personal preference. I'm going to pop over here into color, going to warm this up to what I remember. That's starting to look a little green, so I'm going to pull a little bit more magenta in, add a touch of sharpening, and there we go. Boom. That is what I remember the photo looking like. I hope that was helpful. I would love for you guys to leave any questions that you have, suggestions for other videos that you'd like to see or tutorials in the comments below. If this was helpful for you, I would love for you to like, comment, share, and I can't wait to share another tutorial with you guys in the future. Bye.